Welcome to Chapter 5 of the series, Back to Basics with Retina South Africa. In this chapter, we are going to look at the chambers of the eye. But as we continue, I would like to acknowledge that our education programs at Retina South Africa are supported thanks to unconditional grants, thanks to Bayer South Africa and Roche Products. In our previous webinar, we discussed the lens of the eye. And in that chapter, we actually briefly hinted that the eye is not just one ball, one big eyeball. Today, we're going to discuss that the eye, in fact, is divided into little chambers. And in fact, as I chat to different people, I frequently find that they're totally unaware that the eye is just not one big ball with one big section filled with something or other. The eye is divided into different sections or chambers, and that is what we will clarify in this chapter of Back to Basics with Retina South Africa. So let's get started. If we look at a cross-section of the eye, we can immediately identify completely separate areas. One near the front or the anterior of the eye, and this is known as the anterior chamber. And you might not have noticed, but just between the iris and the lens is another little chamber known as the posterior chamber. And then behind that, you can't miss the fact that there is a very large chamber known as the vitreous chamber. And if we look at the eye in any cross-section, you will immediately be able to identify these chambers. You can see the anterior chamber that is situated here between the cornea and the iris. And just behind that, between the iris and the lens, is the posterior chamber, and the larger area behind the lens and taking up the bulk of the eyeball, we find the vitreous chamber. The chambers of the eye are certainly not empty. Each is filled with a fluid. In summary, we can say that the fluids maintain the shape of the eyeball, but of course there's a little bit more to it than just that. First, as you might have guessed by now, the three fluid chambers in the eye correspond with the cavities that we mentioned earlier. As we look again at a cross-section of the eye, we will immediately be able to identify, for example, the anterior chamber, which is situated just in front of the iris. So this can be known as the anterior chamber or the anterior fluid chamber. The posterior chamber, as we know, is situated behind the iris and just in front of the lens, and it can be known as the posterior chamber or the posterior fluid chamber. And taking up the bulk of the eyeball is the vitreous chamber, which is a chamber filled with vitreous fluid. And we already know that this is behind the lens. Any cross-section of the eye that you come across, you will be able to identify these chambers and know that there are chambers filled with different fluids. Let's start with the anterior chamber. The anterior chamber is filled with what we call aqueous humor. That is just a very smart word for watery substance, a watery fluid. It is clear, otherwise we wouldn't be able to see through it, and it is a free-flowing liquid. It's very important to know that it is free-flowing. Aqueous humor is constantly being manufactured in the eye, and it fills the clear part in the front of the eye. It is so important because aqueous humor actually maintains the correct pressures in the eye. But not only that, it also provides nourishment and removes waste. So to repeat once again, in summary, the eye constantly produces very small amounts of aqueous humor, this watery substance, and an equal amount flows out all the time through what is known as the trabecular meshwork in the drainage angle. This is a very well designed and very efficient system to keep the aqueous humor fresh. That is, new fluid is supplied as the old is drained away. Now, why is aqueous humor so important then? First of all, the eye structures in the anterior and the posterior chambers of the eye actually have no blood supply. If they had a blood supply and there was blood floating around there, it would no longer be transparent and you wouldn't be able to see through that area. So these areas have to rely on a different source for their nourishment, and that is what aqueous humor supplies to these areas. At the same time, the aqueous humor, as we mentioned, removes all the rubbish, all the waste from the eye as it flows through the anterior and posterior chambers before eventually draining away. And as we said, very, very important to remember, this is the area that is responsible for maintaining proper, balanced pressure in the eye at all times. Imbalances in the aqueous humor can lead to high pressures in the eye, that is raised intraocular pressure or IOP, and that leads to glaucoma. And as we know, glaucoma can be dangerous because it can definitely damage our vision. High intraocular pressure then, which originates in the anterior chamber, causes pressure all the way back in the eye until it starts causing damage in the back of the eye, and we then have a major problem. So if we look at any summary then of glaucoma, you'll see that there's some or other blockage of the drainage channel, and this could be for different reasons, and that causes a pressure buildup throughout the eye, and that pressure causes such damage that it actually interferes with vision and can permanently damage vision. Now let's have a look at the vitreous chamber, that bulky part of the eyeball. It's the back 2/3 of the eye, in fact, and it contains what's known as vitreous humor, which is almost like a jelly-like substance. It is colorless, and as we said, it is gel-like. The function of the vitreous is to maintain the round eyeball shape and to maintain also vision clarity, to allow light through without hindrance. It is also very important because it absorbs shock to the head or to the eye. So if you get a bang on the eye, it doesn't disturb the retina and damage the retina because the vitreous will act as a shock absorber. Now, degeneration of the vitreous is a normal process of aging, and we find that there is a decrease in the viscosity. In other words, the vitreous becomes less dense, and this can lead to a separation from the retina. This can cause disruptions in what one sees, and very commonly people report floaters in the eye. Very significant or rapid degeneration can cause a vitreous detachment, a sudden, and typically the person reports flashes of light, and there can be ruptured blood vessels, retinal tears, and even a macular hole. So if anybody sees these flashes of light, they must go immediately to an ophthalmologist to get that checked out. In other words, seeing those flashing lights in the eye signifies a problem and must be dealt with immediately. We have to stress this is an ocular emergency and needs immediate attention. In our next chapter, we are going to discuss children and myopia and whether this is a new epidemic facing us. If you have any questions, please email them to us at headoffice@retinasa.org.za, or you can call us at 0860 5959 59. Thank you.